The wind tasted of rust and distance. Atsabige felt it not as a breeze but as a pressure against his skin, a constant reminder of all the years the land had endured without him. He stood on the rise overlooking Sierra Crossing, the town a scatter of sun-bleached wood and false fronts huddled against the immensity of the high plateau. It had grown. The silver boom had fed it, and now the railroad was giving it a different kind of life, a harder, more angular one. He could hear the faint, rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel from the rail spur. A sound that did not belong here, a heartbeat alien to the earth. His horse, a sturdy buckskin mare, shifted its weight, patient. She had carried him a long way, away from the green lands of the forts and the bitter memories of the uniform he wore for the blue coats. A scout. They had called him a scout. To his own people, he had been a ghost, a man who walked between worlds and belonged to neither. The guilt of it was a smooth, heavy stone in his gut. He had worn their uniform to learn their ways, to understand the power that had broken the people. He had thought it was a path to protecting what was left. Instead, it had only led him farther away, while his own blood, his brother Nakai, had vanished into the very wilderness he was supposed to know. He nudged the mare forward, down the gentle slope toward the town. His goal was twofold: to find Nakai and to reclaim the sliver of canyonland where his mother's people had summered for generations, now held in the fist of a name he had heard whispered from forts to reservation lines. Ezekiel Dorn. The land was marked on their maps as property of the Sierra Pacific Railroad. Tuatsa. It was the land of his ancestors, a place where the spirits of the earth spoke in the sigh of the pinon pine. The town's main street was a river of fine red dust, stirred into choking clouds by the passage of a freight wagon. Men in dusty hats and worn denims watched him from the shade of wooden awnings, their eyes lingering on the rifle in his saddle scabbard, on the dine patterns of his woven blanket roll, on the quiet set of his face. He was an unwelcome story walking into their town, a living piece of the history they were trying to bury under mine tailings and railroad ties. He ignored their stares, his gaze sweeping over the buildings. Saloon, general store, marshal's office, assayer. Nothing had changed, yet everything was different. The air was thick with a new kind of desperation, the brittle edge of men who were not finding the silver they had been promised. The drought had seen to that, leaving the land gasping and the creeks running thin as thread. He dismounted in front of the livery, the scent of hay and horse sweat a familiar comfort. He paid the stable hand, a boy with eyes too old for his face, and gave him simple instructions for the mare's care. He would start at the saloon. Information in a town like this flowed on whiskey. He needed to find a track, a sign, any hint of the path Nakai might have walked. The last word was a year old. A letter from a priest saying Nakai had been seen working a cattle drive near this territory. A drive owned by Ezekiel Dorn. Then, nothing. A few miles east, Eleanor Whitlock hammered another staple into a fence post, the jarring shock running up her arm. Each metallic strike was a small act of defiance against the land, against the debt, against the shadow of the railroad that loomed over her small ranch. The barbed wire, a new and vicious kind of fence, gleamed in the relentless sun. It was meant to keep her small herd of cattle from wandering, to protect her meager patch of grazing land from the vast herds of Dorn. It was a line drawn in the dust, a declaration that she was still here. Her father had died 2 years ago, a so-called accident on the railroad tracks he had helped survey. The official report said he had misjudged the speed of an unscheduled work train. Eleanor knew her father. He did not misjudge things like that. He had left her with a ranch, a mountain of debt owed to the same railroad company, and a deep, abiding distrust of the promises of progress. Now, she was fighting to keep it all from crumbling. The drought was killing her pasture. The bank was pressing her for payment, and Dorn's men were constantly testing her boundaries, their cattle pushing against her fences as if by accident. She straightened up, wiping a smear of sweat and grime from her brow with the back of a leather glove. She was in her 20s, with a strength in her shoulders forged from hard labor and a resolve in her hazel eyes that few men in Sierra Crossing cared to challenge directly. Her past was a quiet complication. To pay down the initial debt after her father's death, she had taken a contract to supply hay to the railroad, dealing with Ezekiel Dorn's logistics manager. The deal had felt like a betrayal of her father's memory, a compromise that left a bitter taste in her mouth. She had paid off that contract, but the larger bank debt remained, a chain around her neck. Today, she was going into town to pick up a wagon load of salt licks and grain, paid for with the last of her credit at the general store. It was a gamble. If the rains did not come soon, the feed would not last, and she would lose everything. The thought sent a familiar chill of fear through her, cold despite the oppressive heat. She finished her work, her movements economical and sure. She would not be broken. She would hold this land. It was all she had left of him. The Lost Borough Saloon was dim and smelled of stale beer, sweat, and cheap perfume. Atza let his eyes adjust. His posture relaxed, but every sense alert. He took a seat at a small table in the corner, a place where he could watch the room and the door. He ordered a water. The bartender grunted and slid a cloudy glass across the worn wood. Atza nursed it, listening to the low murmur of conversations, sifting through the boasts and complaints for anything of value. He had been there for nearly an hour when Eleanor Whitlock walked in. She did not belong in a place like this, and she knew it. She walked with a purpose that defied the leering eyes of the off-duty miners and ranch hands. She went directly to the bar, speaking in a low, firm voice to the bartender, who also served as the freight agent for the mercantile. Atza watched the transaction, the exchange of papers. He saw the tension in her shoulders. She was a woman carrying a heavy load. As she turned to leave, her papers in hand, two men moved to block her path. They were Dorn's men. Atza had seen their type hanging around every railhead and cattle yard from here to the territories. They were bullies who fed on the fear of others. The first man, large and slovenly, gave her a gap-toothed grin. He said, "Well now, Miss Whitlock, out all on your lonesome? That is not safe for a lady." Eleanor's chin lifted. She stated, "I am not a lady, and I am not your concern. Step aside." The second man, wiry and quick, chuckled. His hand darted out and snatched the papers from her grasp. He asked, "What we got here, shipping invoice, looks like a mighty expensive load of feed for a failing ranch." Eleanor's hand dropped to the worn axe handle she carried tucked in her belt, a tool she used for repairs, but also a plain and effective warning. She demanded, "Give that back." The large man stepped closer, his bulk crowding her. His voice dropped to a menacing purr. "Maybe we can discuss a new payment plan. Dorn is always looking for new ways to collect on old debts." It was a performance. Atza realized, a cruel piece of theater designed to humiliate her, to break her will in a public space. This was how men like Dorn worked. Through inches and whispers and small acts of violence that chipped away at a person until nothing was left. And then Atza saw it. The second man, the wiry one holding the papers, turned his wrist just so. On the inside of his leather cuff, Atza saw a small, dark marking. It was a brand, a crude design of a Z and a D. He had seen it before, on a piece of stolen tack found near a raided homestead 200 miles south. But that was not what held his gaze. Dangling from the man's belt, next to a skinning knife, was a smaller blade. The handle was carved from juniper wood, inlaid with a turquoise chip in the precise geometric pattern of his own clan. It was a pattern Nakai had been taught by their grandfather. It was his brother's knife. Everything slowed. The smoke in the air, the lazy spin of the ceiling fan, the guttural laughter of the men. All of it faded until only the knife remained. A burning point of focus. Nakai had been here, or this man had met him. The thought was a jolt of lightning, igniting a cold fire within him. Before the first man could lay a hand on Eleanor, Atza was moving. He did not draw his pistol. He did not make a sound. He rose from his chair and crossed the space in 3 silent strides. He came upon the wiry man from the side. His hands shot out, not for the knife, but for the man's wrist. He applied pressure with his thumb to the nerve cluster there, a technique he had learned not from the army, but from an old Apache warrior. The man yelped, his fingers going numb and releasing the papers. Atsa caught them in his other hand. The big man turned, his eyes wide with surprise, his hand reaching for his gun. Atsa did not wait. He shoved the wiry man into his larger companion, sending them both stumbling backward into a table. Wood splintered. Glasses shattered. The saloon went quiet. Every eye was on him. Atsa stood perfectly still, the papers held loosely in his hand. He looked at the 2 men scrambling to their feet, their faces a mixture of fury and shock. He let the silence stretch, his gaze flat and unreadable. He had what he needed, the confirmation. He knew the path started here. He turned his head slightly and looked at Eleanor. He held out the papers. She stared at him, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Her eyes were wide, confused, but the fear in them was being replaced by something else, a flicker of guarded disbelief. She took the papers from his hand, her fingers brushing his. The big man finally untangled himself and found his voice. It was a roar of outrage. "You will pay for that, you filthy—" Before he could finish the slur, the saloon doors swung open and Marshal Pike filled the doorway. He was a thick, barrel-chested man with a drooping mustache and pale, cold eyes. He surveyed the scene, his gaze skipping over the 2 henchmen and Eleanor, and settling on Atsa with an undisguised contempt. Pike's voice was a low growl. He asked, "What is the meaning of this? Bigay, I heard you were back in town, making trouble on your first day. That is just like your kind." One of Dorn's men whined. "He attacked us, Marshal, for no reason. We were just having a friendly conversation with the lady." Marshal Pike nodded slowly, as if this was the only version of the story he was capable of hearing. He looked at Atsa. "I am warning you. I want you out of my town by sunrise. We do not need your sort stirring up dust." Atsa said nothing. He simply held the marshal's gaze. He had seen 100 men like Pike. Small men given a sliver of power who used it to puff themselves up. Arguing with them was like arguing with the wind. Eleanor found her voice. It was steady now, and clear. She stated, "That is not what happened. Marshal, these men were harassing me. They stole my property. This man," she gestured toward Atsa, "he helped me." Pike barely glanced at her. He advised, "You would be wise to choose your company more carefully. Miss Whitlock. Some folks might get the wrong idea about a woman who defends an Indian over 2 of Mr. Dorn's employees." The threat was unmistakable. A casual twist of the knife. Her reputation, her business, her very survival in this town depended on the goodwill of men like him. And he was telling her, in front of everyone, that she was now on the wrong side. Atsa watched the 2 men retreat from the saloon, their backward glances filled with venom. He knew they would be back. They had the law on their side. He had a clue. It was not a fair fight. But the fights in this land rarely were. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Eleanor, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. Then he turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving the stale air and the hostile stares behind him. The red dust of the street met him like an old friend, and the relentless, thirsty wind began to whisper his brother's name. Eleanor Whitlock watched him leave the saloon, a figure of quiet purpose moving through the afternoon glare. The townsfolk parted before him, their scorn a tangible thing. Yet he seemed not to notice. He walked with a stillness that was more unnerving than any swagger. She remained by the bar, the rescued shipping invoice clutched in her hand, her heart still beating a rapid rhythm against her ribs. Marshal Pike had given her a final, dismissive glance before turning his attention to restoring order, his version of order, which meant placating Dorn's men. She knew then, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her stomach, that there was no law for her in Sierra Crossing. Not anymore. She finished her business, overseeing the loading of her grain sacks and salt licks onto her wagon with a deliberate, unhurried pace. She would not let them see her run. But as she prepared to head back to the ranch, she saw him again. Apache was riding his buckskin mare out of the livery. He did not take the main track east toward the open range. Instead, he turned north, following the faint trail that led toward the old postal route, a path rarely used since the railroad came through. He rode low in the saddle, his attention fixed on the ground ahead of him. He was tracking. A knot of indecision tightened within her. The marshal's warning echoed in her mind, a threat to her precarious existence, but the image of the carved juniper knife, and the sudden violent clarity in the Navajo's eyes when he saw it, spoke of a deeper story, a story that felt connected to the rot at the heart of this town, the same rot that had likely consumed her father. On impulse, she tied her saddle horse to the back of the wagon and urged her team forward, not east toward home, but north, keeping a careful, dusty distance behind the lone rider. The trail Apache followed was plain enough to a trained eye. 2 horses, moving with haste. One of them had a shoe that was slightly loose on the right forefoot, leaving a faint, telltale scrape in the dust. More telling was the dark, intermittent stain on the ground, a steady drip from a leaking canteen. Careless, it spoke of men who were not accustomed to conserving water, men who believed the world owed them a full cup. He knew these men believed they were the hunters, but their arrogance made them easy prey. He let the mare pick her way through the greasewood and sage, his mind a quiet pool of concentration. The anger from the saloon had cooled, leaving behind a hard, sharp resolve. That knife was a piece of his brother, a piece of his home. Finding it was the first true sign he had found in a year of searching. It was a promise and a pain, a thread he had to pull, no matter where it led. The smell of smoke reached him before he saw the ruin. It was a cold scent, the ghost of a fire. He rounded a cluster of weathered sandstone formations and saw what was left of the old Miller's Creek postal station. The small sod and timber building was a blackened skeleton. The corral fence was broken, and the water trough was overturned, a dark patch of mud drying and cracking in the sun. He dismounted, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle as he scanned the desolate scene. The fire was a day old, maybe 2. The tracks of the 2 horses from town were here, mingled with the prints of at least 3 others. There had been a fight. A mail sack lay ripped open, its contents scattered and singed. A heavy wooden chair was smashed to pieces. He walked the scene in a slow, expanding circle. He found spent cartridges, both pistol and rifle. Near the overturned trough, where the mud was deepest, he saw something else, a single, small bead of blue stone, pressed into the drying earth. He knelt and carefully worked it free. It was turquoise, sky blue with a fine black spiderweb matrix. It was from the Dineta, the land of the people. He had seen his brother work with beads just like this one, inlaying them into the handles of his knives. He closed his fist around the small stone. It was another piece of the puzzle, another cold confirmation. Nakai had been here. He had been part of this violence. A sound, the crunch of wagon wheels on gravel, made him straighten up. He turned, his body instinctively positioning itself between the ruin and the newcomer. Eleanor Whitlock was pulling her wagon to a halt 100 yards away. She sat on the driver's bench, her hands holding the reins, her face a mask of uncertainty. She had followed him. The realization did not surprise him as much as it should have. He had seen the steel in her spine at the saloon. She was not a woman who easily let things go. He stood his ground and waited. She wrapped the reins and climbed down from the wagon, her movements stiff. She approached slowly, her eyes taking in the burned station, the scattered debris, and finally, him. Her gaze was direct, questioning. She stopped about 20 feet away. She asked, "What happened here?" It was not a question so much as a demand for an explanation. Apache considered her. The town saw her as a struggling rancher, a woman alone. He saw something more. He saw a fighter, cornered but not beaten. He had interfered in her trouble at the saloon to get closer to the man with the knife. Now, she had followed him into his own search. Their paths had crossed for a reason. Still, the habit of silence was strong. He had learned long ago that words were weapons, and he did not share them carelessly. He answered simply, "Trouble." Eleanor's gaze swept over the ruin again. She had a feeling this was more than a random act of vandalism. This was Dorn's work. It had his scent all over it, the casual brutality, the destruction of anything that served the small, independent folk of the territory. She took a few more steps closer, her eyes falling on the invoice she still carried, now tucked into her belt. She said, "The men in the saloon, they were involved in this." It was a statement of fact. Atsa gave a slight nod. His silence was a challenge, a wall she had to decide whether or not to climb. She looked from his impassive face to his horse, then to her own horse tied to the wagon. The animals were suffering in the heat, their heads hanging low, their flanks slick with sweat. His canteen, she noticed, looked nearly empty. So was hers. This land took everything. It took your strength, your hope, your water. She was tired of fighting it alone. She was tired of being afraid. She said, "I know a little about Mr. Dorn and his business. My father worked for the railroad." She paused, the words costing her. "I even supplied them with hay for a time, to pay a debt. I know how they operate." She pulled the invoice from her belt. "This freight order, it is for a mining concern. But the delivery point is not a mine. It is a blind canyon on Dorn's old north pasture. And these initials, ZD, they are on the order." Atsa looked at the paper she held out. He saw the letters, ZD, printed in dark ink. He remembered the brand on the man's cuff, Z for Ezekiel, D for Dorn, a private mark for a private army. So the men who took his brother were not just common thieves. They were organized. They were Dorn's. He looked back at her, a new understanding in his eyes. She was not just a victim. She was a source of information. He fought the instinct to refuse help, to walk this path alone as he had walked so many others. His pride was a shield, but it was also a cage. Finding Nakai was more important than his pride. He needed to know what she knew. He needed her eyes, her understanding of this side of the world. He made a decision. He walked to his horse and unstrapped his canteen. He went not to his own horse, but to hers, the saddle horse tied to the wagon. The animal shied away, its eyes rolling. He spoke to it in a low, soft murmur of dyne, his voice a calming current. He unscrewed the cap of his canteen and poured a small amount of the precious water into his cupped hand. He held it out for the horse. The animal hesitated. Then, trusting the scent of the man and the promise of water, it lowered its head and drank gratefully from his palm. Eleanor watched, her throat tight. No white man she knew would give his water to another's horse before his own, especially not out here. It was an act of profound respect, a quiet gesture that spoke louder than any words. It was an acknowledgement of their shared struggle against the harshness of the land. In that moment, something shifted between them. The barrier of race and reputation, so solid in town, seemed to crumble to dust out here under the vast, uncaring sky. She saw not an Indian, but a man who understood the value of a good horse, a man who understood the laws of survival that superseded the petty laws of men. When he was done, he straightened up and looked at her. She said his name was Nakai. He had a knife. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. She asked, "Your brother?" He nodded once more. "This land that was taken, the parcel by the canyon, it belonged to our mother's people. Dorn claims it. I think my brother tried to get it back." The pieces clicked into place for her. Dorn did not just want her ranch for the water. He wanted all the land, all the water, all the power. He used men like Atsa's brother, desperate men on the fringes, to do his dirty work, branding them as outlaws to cover his own crimes. And he had done something similar to her father, using the power of the railroad to erase him when he became inconvenient. She declared, The old Dorn place, the one listed on this invoice? It is a day's ride from here. If we cut across the Alkali Flats, it is dangerous ground, but it is faster than the main trail. They would not expect anyone to come from that direction. Atsa looked at her, then toward the shimmering white expanse of the flats to the west. It was a hard ride, but she was right. It was the last way they would expect to be followed. He said, "You do not have to do this. This is my fight." She met his gaze, her own resolve hardening. She replied, "Dorn's men threatened me in a public saloon. The marshal threatened me for speaking the truth. Your brother may be lost, but my father is dead. I think, Mr. Bigay, it has become my fight too." Atsa considered her words. He saw no fear in her, only a weary determination that matched his own. They were two people pushed to the edge, with nothing to lose and a shared enemy to face. He gave a slow nod, an agreement, a partnership forged in dust and desperation. He said, "We will need more water, and we travel at night. The heat on those flats can kill a horse." Eleanor nodded. She agreed. "My ranch is a few hours east. We can get supplies there and leave the wagon. Then we can double back." They stood for a moment longer in the silence of the burned-out station. Two solitary figures against a landscape of red rock and bleached bone. The trust between them was new and fragile. A tiny spring of water in a vast desert. But it was there. They turned and walked toward the horses. The first steps of their journey together. A quiet pact made on the scorched earth of a forgotten place. The air at Eleanor Whitlock's ranch was thin and still, holding the day's heat long after the sun had bled away behind the western mesas. They moved in the deep twilight, not with the haste of fugitives, but with the deliberate economy of people who understood the cost of a wasted movement or a careless noise. Eleanor had packed dried beef and hardtack into their saddlebags, alongside full canteens drawn from the deep, reliable well her father had dug. They left her wagon under a canvas sheet and took only their saddle horses, her sturdy bay gelding and Atsa's buckskin mare. The land they rode into was a vast and silent thing, lit by a spray of stars so bright they seemed to crackle in the immense quiet. Atsa rode a few paces ahead, a dark shape against the paler dust of the trail. He was not following the path itself, but the subtle language of the land beside it. He was looking for the sign of other riders, for the faint disturbances that would tell him they were being pursued. Eleanor watched him, a growing respect quieting her own anxieties. He moved as if he were a part of the night, as if the darkness was his natural element. In town, he had been an outcast, a threat. Out here, he was a guardian. After a few hours, he reined in his mare and dismounted. Eleanor drew up beside him. He knelt, his fingers tracing something in the dust she could not see. He said, "3 riders. They passed this way an hour ago. They are moving fast." Eleanor asked, "A posse?" He did not answer directly. He replied, "Marshal Pike has long arms, and the men of Dorn are eager. They will expect us to make for the border, or to double back toward the mining camps. They will not expect us to go west, into the Badlands." She looked to the west, where the land broke apart into a maze of canyons and rock formations, a formidable and waterless barrier. She said, "Coyote Gulch. My father told me never to go in there. He said it was a place that swallows trails and people." Atsa stood, his gaze fixed on that dark horizon. He said, "It is the only way they will not follow. Not at night. We can be through it by morning if we push hard." It was a choice between the known danger behind them and the unknown danger ahead. She looked at the man before her, his face half hidden in shadow, and trusted the certainty in his voice. She nodded. She said, "Lead the way." The entrance to Coyote Gulch was a narrow slash in the rock, a dark mouth that seemed to exhale a palpable heat. Inside, the air was dead and close. The starlight was cut off by the high, sheer walls of red sandstone, and they were plunged into a profound darkness. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic clop of their horses' hooves on the rocky ground and the whisper of their own breathing. They moved in single file, the mare following the gelding following Atsa, who led them on foot, his hand on the gelding's bridle. He was their eyes, feeling the path with his feet, his memory, his instinct. The hours passed in a slow, tense procession. The canyon twisted and turned, sometimes opening into wide, sandy washes, other times narrowing so much that their stirrups scraped against the rock walls. The silence pressed in on them. It was a place that felt ancient and hostile, a landscape that had no regard for the small, warm lives passing through it. Just as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, disaster struck. Eleanor's gelding, tired and unsure of its footing in the gloom, stumbled hard. The horse let out a pained snort and went lame, favoring its left foreleg. Eleanor was out of the saddle in an instant, her heart pounding. Atsa was there beside her, his calm a steadying presence. He ran his hand down the horse's leg, his touch firm but gentle. He lifted the hoof, tilting it to catch the growing light. Eleanor asked, "Is it broken?" The words were a knot of fear in her throat. Atsa shook his head. He said, "No, the hoof is cracked, a deep crack. To the quick. He will be in pain. He can walk, but it will be slow, very slow." The implication hung in the air between them. Slow was a death sentence out here. Behind them, somewhere on the plains, a posse was riding with the sunrise. They could not stay here, but leaving the horse was unthinkable. It was a betrayal she could not stomach. Atsa looked at her face. Reading the conflict in her eyes, he said, "We will walk. We will rest when the sun is high. We can make a dressing for the hoof from my blanket and leather from the saddlebags. It will help." His pragmatism was a relief. He was not abandoning the animal. He was simply solving the problem. They started forward again, 2 people and 2 horses, now moving at the slow, painful pace of the injured gelding. As the sun climbed higher, the canyon became an oven. The rock walls radiated a ferocious heat, and the air shimmered. Their water was warm and tasted of metal. Every swallow was a conscious decision, a careful rationing against the long hours ahead. Around midday, the wind began to change. It had been a hot, steady breeze, but now it came in sharp, unpredictable gusts, whipping sand and dust into their faces. The sky, which had been a clear, piercing blue, was taking on a hazy, yellow tint. Atsa stopped, his head lifted, sniffing the air like an animal. He looked at the sky. His eyes narrowed. He stated, "A storm is coming, a bad one. We need to find shelter." They scanned the canyon walls. The rock was mostly sheer, offering no protection. Then Eleanor spotted it, a shallow alcove carved into the base of the cliff, a place where a spring might have flowed centuries ago. It was not deep, but it was their only hope. They led the horses into the overhang, pressing themselves back against the cool stone as the wind began to howl. Atsa pulled a strip of cloth from his pack and handed it to her. He said, "Wet this with the canteen. Tie it over your face. Do not breathe the sand." She did as he instructed, the damp cloth a small comfort against her skin. He did the same, and they stood side by side, their faces masked, their eyes watching as the world outside their small shelter dissolved into a churning, roaring wall of yellow sand. The sun vanished. The sky was gone. There was only the storm. The sound was a physical thing, a deafening roar that vibrated through the rock and into their bones. The sand blasted against the cliff, a relentless assault. Eleanor felt a wave of dizziness, of disorientation. The world had been reduced to noise and chaos. She could not see, could not hear anything but the wind. A primal fear, the fear of being buried alive, began to creep into her mind. She felt a touch on her arm. It was Atsa. He leaned close, his masked face inches from hers. His voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the storm. He said, "Close your eyes. Do not try to see. Feel the rock behind you. Feel it in your feet. The wind comes from the west. The storm is a river. We are behind a stone in the current. Feel the way the stone holds. It is steady. Be the stone. She closed her eyes, forcing her panicked breathing to slow. She pressed her back against the cliff face, trying to do as he said. At first, she felt nothing but the raw vibration of the storm. But then, as she focused, she began to feel what he meant. She could feel the deep, solid strength of the mountain at her back. She could feel the direction of the wind not as a sound, but as a pressure, a steady, unwavering force against the rock. It was a strange and profound sensation. He was teaching her a new way of sensing the world, a way of listening not with her ears, but with her bones. The fear receded, replaced by a strange sense of calm. They stood there for a long time, two silent, masked figures braced against the storm, a shared, unspoken understanding passing between them through the solid rock. When the wind finally began to lose its fury, they were both exhausted. The world outside was transformed, the canyon floor covered in smooth, flowing dunes of new sand. The air was still thick with dust, but the roaring had subsided to a low moan. They lowered the cloths from their faces. Eleanor spoke first, her voice raspy. She said, "I have never seen anything like that." Atza nodded, his eyes scanning the new landscape. He said, "The land is remade. It erases all tracks, ours, and the posse's. For now, we are safe from them." The shared danger had stripped away their last reserves of formality. They were two survivors in a hostile world. Eleanor looked at the man beside her, at the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him. She felt a sudden, urgent need to be honest, to lay down the burden of her own secrets. She said, "The hay contract I told you about, the one I had with the railroad, it was not just about the debt. My father, before he died, he had been arguing with them. He was a surveyor. He knew this land better than anyone. He said their new spur line, the one to the old silver claims, was unstable. He said the grade was too steep, the bedrock too soft. He refused to sign off on the plans. A week later, he was dead, an accident." She took a shaky breath. She continued, "I was alone. The bank was going to take everything. Dorn's man offered me the contract, good money for hay. All I had to do was stop asking questions about my father. So I took it. I took their money, and I kept my mouth shut. I've been living with that for 2 years. I think they killed him. Atza, I think they killed him, and I helped them cover it up." The confession spilled out of her, raw and painful. She expected him to judge her, to see her as a coward or a collaborator. Instead, he just watched her, his dark eyes filled with a deep, quiet sorrow. He understood the weight of a choice made in desperation. When she was finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low. He said, "I wore a blue coat for the United States Army. I was a scout. I led their columns. I tracked for them. I thought if I learned their ways, I could help my people. I thought I could be a bridge." He looked away, his gaze fixed on the sand-swept canyon. "But a bridge is a thing that is walked on from both sides. To the soldiers, I was always the Navajo. To my people, I was the man in the blue coat, a ghost. I was away, learning to fight their way. When my brother needed me here, this trouble he is in, it is my fault. I was not here to guide him." His own confession was a stone dropped into a deep well, the ripples spreading out in the silence. Eleanor saw him then, truly saw him for the first time. She saw the immense burden he carried, the profound and lonely conflict of a man caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. The guilt he felt for his brother was the same as the guilt she felt for her father. They were both haunted by the past, by the choices they had made to survive. An empathy, powerful and pure, flowed between them. They were not so different after all. The last of the wind died away, leaving an almost holy silence. The air began to clear, revealing the stark, beautiful, and dangerous world they had to cross. The path ahead was uncertain. Their enemies were still out there, but they were no longer strangers. They were allies, bound not just by a common enemy, but by the shared weight of their own flawed human hearts. Atsa went to his saddlebag and pulled out a clean strip of blanket. He began to fashion a careful, tight binding for the gelding's injured hoof. The journey back from Coyote Gulch was a slow pilgrimage of endurance. They traveled through the cool of the night, walking beside the horses, saving their strength and the animals for the arduous miles. The buckskin mare carried their depleted supplies, while Eleanor's gelding limped bravely, its hoof protected by the dressing Atsa had fashioned. They spoke little, their shared confessions in the storm having created a new kind of quiet between them, one of comfortable understanding rather than cautious distance. He taught her how to read the stars for direction, not just the North Star, but the patterns and stories the Dine saw in the sky. She, in turn, told him about the seasons on the ranch, the way the light changed on the mesas, the particular scent of the air before a rare summer rain. They were mapping their worlds for each other, one story at a time. They saw the ranch at dawn, a small, hopeful collection of buildings nestled in a shallow draw. For Eleanor, it was the first time in 2 years that the sight of home did not bring a fresh wave of anxiety. It felt different, returning not alone, but with an ally. That feeling evaporated the moment they got closer. Even from a distance, something was wrong. The cattle were not scattered across the pasture. They were clustered in a tight, distressed bunch near the far western fence line. Atsa saw it at the same time. He put a hand on her arm, a silent signal to halt. His gaze was sharp. Sweeping the perimeter, he said, "The wire is cut. Over there." They approached with caution. The scene was worse than she had imagined. A long section of her new barbed wire fence had been snipped and rolled back. The cattle, drawn by the scent of the last remaining water in the rapidly shrinking creek bed just beyond her property, had been driven through the gap. They were now trapped, squeezed between the fence and the steep bank of the draw, lowing with thirst and confusion. It was a deliberate, calculated act of cruelty. Dorn was not just trying to steal her cattle. He was trying to destroy them, to break her spirit by making her watch her livelihood perish a few hundred feet from her own well. A cold, hard anger rose in Eleanor, eclipsing her exhaustion. This was her home. These were her animals. She would not let him win. She looked at Atsa. The same quiet fury was reflected in his eyes. He understood this was more than offense. It was a violation. They spent the rest of the morning painstakingly herding the cattle back onto her land and patching the fence. The work was grueling under the hot sun. Afterward, while the animals drank their fill from the well trough, Eleanor knew she had to go into town. The gelding's hoof needed proper attention from a blacksmith, and they needed supplies. More importantly, she needed to see who was watching. She found old Ben at his forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer a steady heartbeat in the town's dusty silence. He was a man bent and weathered by a lifetime of fire and steel, with kind eyes that held a deep, settled sadness. As he expertly examined the gelding's hoof, she spoke in a low voice about the cut fences. Ben did not look up from his work. He said, "That has Dorn's mark on it. He wants that water of yours. He wants it all." Eleanor replied, "The marshal will not do anything." Ben finally paused, his eyes meeting hers over the horse's back. He said, "Marshal Pike does what Dorn pays him to do. Be careful. Eleanor, your father, he was a good man, a stubborn one. He saw things he should not have seen." "What things? Ben, what did he see?" The blacksmith's gaze flickered nervously toward the street. He shook his head and went back to his work, his voice barely a whisper. He said, "Some things are best left buried. For your own good." He began to hammer again, the loud ringing of the steel an emphatic end to the conversation. As Eleanor was leaving the smithy, a man in a dusty uniform stepped out of the marshal's office. He was younger than Pike, with a lean build and a thoughtful, serious face. His name was Deputy Torres, and he was known to be a quiet, decent man trapped in a difficult job. He tipped his hat. He said, "Miss Whitlock, I heard about the trouble at your place." Eleanor replied, "You heard correctly. Deputy, my fences were cut and my stock was run off." Torres looked uncomfortable. His eyes shifted, avoiding hers. He said, "The marshal logged it as stray cattle and weather damage to an old fence." Eleanor's temper flared. She said, "That was new wire, and you know it. Those cattle were driven." The deputy met her gaze then, and she saw the shame in his eyes. He spoke softly, for her ears only. He said, "I know, just be watchful tonight. Some of Dorn's men were in the saloon earlier. They were drinking hard and talking loud. They feel they have a score to settle with your guest." It was a warning, a small act of rebellion that could cost him his job. Eleanor nodded her thanks, the single gesture conveying a world of understanding. She had another ally, however constrained he might be. That evening, as the shadows grew long and painted the ranch in shades of orange and purple, Atsa was not resting. He was preparing. He walked the perimeter of the main barn and the house, his movements silent and fluid. He was reading the ground, seeing the approaches, the blind spots, the places of advantage and vulnerability. He did not speak of his preparations, but Eleanor understood. Deputy Torres's warning had confirmed what they both already knew. They were coming back. She joined him, her own exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a tense, focused energy. Under his quiet direction, they worked together. They stretched thin ropes a few inches off the ground across the main paths to the barn. They positioned 2 lanterns in the hayloft, with long cords tied to them, ready to be raised and lowered to create confusing, shifting lights. They checked the action on her father's old shotgun and Atsa's rifle, laying out the ammunition where it could be reached in the dark. They sat in the deep gloom of the barn, the scent of hay and animals a comforting familiarity in the tense silence. The injured gelding was in a nearby stall, its breathing soft and even. Atsa had shown her how to use the barn's structure, the narrow passages between the stalls, the ladder to the hayloft, as a defensive maze. They would not fight in the open. They would make the enemy come into their world, into the darkness they controlled. The attack came hours later, long after the moon had set. It began not with a shout, but with the nervous whinny of Eleanor's horse. Atsa was instantly on his feet, a shadow detaching from deeper shadows. He put a finger to his lips, and Eleanor's heart began to pound a heavy, rhythmic beat. Through a crack in the barn wall, they saw them, 4 riders, dark shapes moving with a predatory confidence. They dismounted and began to approach the house first, assuming their prey was asleep inside. As the first man crossed the yard, his boot snagged on the tripwire. He went down with a loud curse, a crash of sound that shattered the night stillness. The others froze for a second, confused. In that second, Eleanor, from her position by the barn door, pulled the cord for the first lantern. A circle of yellow light bloomed in the high window of the hayloft, drawing their attention upward. A shot rang out, and a bullet thudded into the wooden wall high above their heads. Atsa used the distraction. He moved like a ghost along the side of the barn, his rifle a part of him. Another of Dorn's men, bolder than the rest, made a rush for the barn door. As he came around the corner, Atsa was there. It was not a gunshot. It was a swift, brutal impact, the hard wood of the rifle stock connecting with the man's jaw. The man crumpled without a sound. The 2 remaining attackers, now spooked and firing blindly at the phantom light in the hayloft, began to advance more cautiously. Eleanor pulled the second cord, and another lantern appeared in a different window, creating a second target. The men shouted in confusion, their sense of direction lost. One of them yelled, "They are in the loft. Circle around." It was the mistake Atsa had been waiting for. As the man moved to circle the barn, he passed a row of empty stalls. From the deep darkness within one of them, Atsa struck again. The fight was short, a flurry of movement and a choked cry. The second man went down. The last man standing, the one who had first tripped, was now in a full-blown panic. He fired his pistol wildly into the dark shape of the barn, then turned and ran for his horse. They let him go. A messenger of fear was more useful than a dead body. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, they came together in the middle of the barn. The air was thick with the sharp smell of gunpowder. Eleanor's hands were shaking, but a fierce, triumphant energy surged through her. They had done it. They had held their ground. Atsa knelt beside the man he had taken down first, the one with the hurt jaw. The man was stirring, groaning. He was young, his face pale with fear in the lantern light. They dragged him into a storage room and tied his hands. The second man, the one from the stalls, was unconscious, but breathing. As Atsa searched the conscious man's pockets for weapons, his fingers closed on a small, stiff piece of cardstock. He pulled it out. It was a fragment of a train ticket, dark and stiff with a dried substance. Blood. Printed on the ticket in stark black letters were the initials ZD, and next to them, the number 13. He held it out for Eleanor to see. She brought the lantern closer, her eyes widening as she recognized the lettering. She whispered, ZD13, like the shipping invoice. Atsa looked at the bloodstain, then at the number. He said, in the army, special cargo, dangerous cargo, was sometimes shipped in a separate car, an unlucky number for an unlucky load. Eleanor's mind raced, connecting the pieces. Her father's warnings about an unstable track, a secret cargo car, the violence at the postal station. She asked, what would they be shipping that needs so much secrecy and violence? Atsa looked toward the dark line of the railroad tracks, miles away, but an ever-present line on the horizon. He answered, dynamite, enough to blast a new path through a mountain, or to erase a mistake. They left the second unconscious man outside the small mission chapel on the edge of town before dawn. They knew he would be found and cared for. They kept the first man, their prisoner, locked securely in Eleanor's root cellar. As the sun rose, casting a clean, new light over the ranch, a sense of grim purpose had settled over them. They had defended their small piece of the world. They had found new allies in the most unlikely of places. And they held a new clue, a blood-stained key that they knew, with a cold certainty, would lead them deeper into the heart of Ezekiel Dorn's darkness. The small, scattered embers of resistance were beginning to glow. The man in the root cellar lasted 2 days. Atsa did not lay a hand on him. He did not need to. He simply sat on an overturned bucket in the cool, earthy darkness, his silence a more potent weapon than any threat. He would bring the man water and a piece of hardtack, then return to his silent vigil. Eleanor would speak to the prisoner, her voice calm and reasonable, telling him that his friends had left him for dead and that Mr. Dorn would not risk himself for a hired hand. It was the combination that broke him her quiet logic and Atsa's unnerving, patient stillness. On the second morning, the man, whose name was Jed, began to talk. He told them about the old North Star silver mine, a played-out claim at the end of a rusty, forgotten spur of the railroad. He said it was Dorn's personal warehouse, a place where cargo could be offloaded away from the prying eyes of the main depot. He described the guards, the routine, the locked office where the foreman kept the shipping manifests. He spoke of a car, number 13, that arrived on an irregular schedule, always at night, and was always unloaded with extreme care. His words painted a clear picture of a well-organized smuggling operation. He knew nothing of a Navajo boy, but the fear in his eyes said he was not telling all he knew. They left him with enough food and water for a week, the cellar door securely barred. Leaving him was a risk, but taking him was impossible, and turning him over to Marshal Pike was a death sentence for them all. They had the location. That was what mattered. They prepared for the next journey, this time swapping Eleanor's injured gelding for a tough, scrappy Mustang she had been training. They studied a survey map her father had drawn years ago, a beautiful, hand-detailed work of art that showed every canyon, spring, and forgotten trail in the territory. Eleanor traced the decaying spur line with her finger. She said, It is a 2-day ride, if we go the long way around the ridges, less, if we cut through the high chaparral. But there is no water that way. Atsa took a small piece of charcoal from the hearth. He looked at the map, his eyes seeing not just the lines and names, but the shape of the land itself. He drew a new line, a faint, dark path that followed the contours, linking dry creek beds and sheltered draws. He said, "There is a way. The deer know it. We will follow their trail. We travel light, and we travel fast." The ride was a blur of sun-baked rock and thorny brush. The pace was relentless, a stark contrast to their slow, careful escape from Coyote Gulch. Atsa pushed them hard, his urgency a silent current that pulled them forward. He was a man unraveling a thread, and he could feel it growing taut. He knew they were getting closer. Eleanor matched his pace, her body aching but her resolve firm. She was no longer just defending her land, she was on the attack. They reached the hills overlooking the North Star mine late on the second day. They made a cold camp in a rocky defile, a place where no fire could be seen. From the ridge line, using her father's old spyglass, they watched the mine. It was exactly as Jed had described, a cluster of weathered buildings, a prominent headframe over the main shaft, and the single rusty track of the spur line gleaming dully in the setting sun. 2 guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements lazy and predictable. They watched through the night as a 3rd guard took over the watch. A little after midnight, a lone locomotive, pushing a single boxcar, chuffed its way up the spur. The boxcar was unmarked, save for a faded number 13 stenciled on its side. A small crew emerged and, under the foreman's watchful eye, began unloading heavy wooden crates into a sturdy wagon. The work was done with a nervous efficiency. Atsa focused the spyglass on the men. He saw the foreman, a big man with a thick beard. He saw the wiry man from the saloon, the one whose knife had started this all. But he did not see Nakai. A cold knot of disappointment and fear tightened in his chest. They waited until the next night, until the hours before dawn when the guard's attention would be at its lowest. They left the horses tethered in the rocks and made their way down the slope on foot, moving from shadow to shadow with a silence born of Atsa's training and Eleanor's familiarity with her own land. The single guard was dozing on a crate near the main office, a rifle across his lap. Atsa circled around him, a phantom in the darkness. Eleanor held her breath. There was a faint scuffle, a muffled grunt, and then silence. When Atsa emerged from the shadow, the guard was gone, and Atsa held the keys from the man's belt. The mine office was small and smelled of stale sweat and cheap whiskey. A thick layer of dust covered everything except a large, leather-bound ledger on the foreman's desk. Atsa stood watch at the door while Eleanor lit a small, shielded lantern, its light a tiny pool in the oppressive darkness. She opened the ledger. Her gasp was sharp in the quiet room. Her finger traced the columns, her eyes wide with disbelief. It was all there, a meticulous record of crime, dates, shipments, and payments. She saw Marshall Pike's name, with regular sums of money listed next to it. She saw payments to a dozen other men, ranchers and businessmen who were pillars of the Sierra Crossing community. She saw entries for surveying fees and right-of-way acquisitions that corresponded to the dates when smaller ranchers in the valley had been mysteriously bought out or driven off their land. And she saw the shipments, crates of rifles listed as drilling equipment, cases of dynamite logged as ore samples. And then she saw the other entries, coded notes in the margins, corresponding to the dates of the dynamite shipments. Ute trouble on the North Range. Navajo raid near Miller's Creek. It was a lie. A carefully constructed narrative of native unrest designed to explain the explosions and violence that were Dorn's tools of expansion. They were using his people as a cover, a convenient, faceless enemy to blame for their own calculated campaign of terror. The social conflict was not just prejudice, it was a weapon. Atsa turned from the door, his eyes drawn to something tacked on the wall behind the desk. It was a cheap, curled tin-type photograph. He stepped closer, taking the lantern from Eleanor. The picture showed 5 men, squinting in the harsh sun, posing with rifles in front of the mine's headframe. 2 of them he recognized instantly, the 2 men who had harassed Eleanor in the saloon. Another was the foreman he had seen from the ridge. They were smiling, proud of their work. And then his blood ran cold. Standing slightly apart from the others, half in shadow, was the 5th man. He was younger than the rest, his frame thin, his face gaunt. He was holding a rifle awkwardly, as if it did not belong in his hands. His expression was not proud or smiling. It was lost, empty. But the face, beneath the dirt and the despair, was unmistakable. It was Nakai. A roaring filled Atsa's ears, the sound of a vast, empty distance opening up inside him. He was alive. His brother was alive. The wave of relief was so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It was followed instantly by a surge of guilt so profound it felt like a physical blow. He had spent years away, learning the white man's ways, while his own brother had fallen into this. He had worn their blue coat and tracked their enemies, while Nakai was starving, lost, and being twisted into a tool for men like Dorn. The empty look in his brother's eyes was a judgment, a mirror showing him the cost of his absence. He reached out and took the photograph from the wall, his hand trembling slightly. This was no longer just a search for a missing person, or a fight to reclaim a piece of land. It had become a rescue. He would not let them destroy his brother. He would pull him out of this darkness, or he would die trying. The guilt did not paralyze him. It forged itself into a cold, diamond-hard purpose. Eleanor watched him, her heart aching at the raw pain she saw on his face. She placed a hand on his arm. She said, "We have what we need. We should go." He nodded, his eyes never leaving the image of his brother. He slid the photograph inside his shirt, the sharp tin corner pressing against his skin, a constant reminder. They took the ledger, a heavy burden of truth, and slipped back out into the night, leaving the bound guard in the office. Back in the safety of their hidden camp, as the sky began to lighten, Eleanor spread her father's map on a flat rock. They had the evidence. Now they needed a plan. Atsa picked up the piece of charcoal he had used before. He looked at the ledger, then at the map. His mind worked, piecing together the shipment dates, the locations of the so-called raids, the layout of the railroad tracks. He saw the pattern. He saw how Dorn was using the chaos he created to move his men and materials. He began to draw on the map, his hand sure and steady. The charcoal left a dark, smudged line, a path of action. He drew the main rail line, the spur to the mine, the switchback on the mountain pass where the trains had to slow to a crawl. He was marking the battlefield. Eleanor watched, her own mind racing, adding her knowledge of the terrain, the locations of sympathetic ranchers, the timing of the town's telegraph messages. The black charcoal dust stained his fingers, and some of it transferred to the map, a shadow spreading along the lines he drew. He was marking a dark path, a dangerous choice that would lead them into a direct confrontation. There was no turning back. Eleanor placed her hand over his on the map, her fingers covering his. The charcoal smudged her skin as well. It was not a promise, but a statement of fact. His fight was her fight. They would walk this dirty, dangerous road together. They did not have the luxury of planning. The sound came on the wind, a faint but unmistakable jangle of harness and the distant, rhythmic beat of shod hooves on rock. It was a sound that did not belong in the high, lonely wilderness. Atsa was on his feet in an instant, the charcoal map forgotten, his head tilted, listening. Eleanor saw the change in him, the immediate shift from quiet strategist to hunted animal. The patrol from the mine was coming back sooner than expected, or they had sent another. There was no time for words. They moved with a desperate, synchronized haste, kicking dirt over their small fire, stuffing the precious ledger into a saddlebag, saddling the horses with trembling, urgent hands. They were exposed, their camp a careless scar on the landscape. They fled north deeper into the broken country, away from any established trail. The pursuit was relentless. They were not lawmen. The men behind them, they were trackers, and they were good. Dorn had chosen his hounds well. For a day and a night, they ran. The chase was a fever dream of dust and sweat, of the burning protest of muscles and the terrified, wide-eyed stares of their horses. They pushed the animals to the brink of collapse, navigating treacherous scree slopes and narrow, winding canyons where an ambush could be waiting around every bend. Twice, the crack of a rifle echoed from the ridges behind them, the bullets whining harmlessly past, meant not to kill but to terrorize, to drive them into making a mistake. Atza led them with an instinct that defied logic, his path a desperate aim weaving thread through a deadly maze. Eleanor followed without question, her trust in him absolute. The world shrank to the heaving flanks of her horse, the ache in her own body, and the steady, determined shape of the man riding ahead of her. Late on the second day, they broke free of the canyons. Before them lay the wide, flat valley of the San Juan River. Atza had been pushing for this, for the river he knew would be their salvation. A deep, swift current would wash away their trail and give them the time they needed to disappear. But as they crested the final rise, the sound that reached them was not the gentle murmur of a river. It was a roar. The San Juan was a brown, churning monster. A storm, unseen by them in the high mountains, had unleashed a flood. The river had devoured its banks, carrying entire trees in its furious current. Crossing was impossible. They were trapped. To their back, the hunters. Before them, the raging water. A profound exhaustion, deeper than any she had ever known, settled over Eleanor. She sagged in the saddle, the last of her strength draining away. Atza reined in, his face grim as he surveyed the impossible water. His gaze swept the valley, searching, and then he pointed, a quarter-mile downstream. A dark line stretched across the torrent. It was a railroad bridge, a skeletal trestle of thick, creosoted timbers. It was a piece of the very machine they were fighting, an ugly scar on the land. But it was also shelter. They reached the bridge as the last light failed. The roar of the water a constant, thunderous presence. The air was cold and damp, smelling of wet earth and decay. They led the horses down the steep, muddy embankment into the space beneath the bridge. It was a cave of wood and stone, the massive timbers crossing overhead like the ribs of some great, dead beast. Water dripped from the beams, and the entire structure groaned and creaked with the strain of the flood, a sound like a ship in a storm. They unsaddled the exhausted horses, rubbing them down with handfuls of dry grass. The animals stood with their heads hanging low, their sides trembling. Eleanor sank to the ground, her back against a stone abutment, her body a single, throbbing ache. The cold of the damp earth seeped into her bones. She began to shiver, an uncontrollable tremor that shook her entire frame. Atza came to her side. He had taken one of the dry saddle blankets and his own woven bedroll. He unfolded the bedroll and wrapped it around her shoulders, his movements sure and gentle. Then he sat down beside her, close enough that his warmth was a shield against the biting chill. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. Their flight was over. For now. They were alive, and they were together. And in that moment, that was enough. They shared the last of their dried beef, chewing the tough, salty meat in a silence broken only by the roar of the river and the groaning of the bridge. The darkness under the trestle was absolute, a profound velvet black that erased the world. They were adrift in sound and sensation, a tiny island of warmth in a universe of cold, rushing water. Eleanor felt the last of her defenses crumble, washed away by the flood of exhaustion and the simple, profound comfort of his presence. All the roles she had played, rancher, daughter, fighter, they all fell away, leaving only the woman, cold and tired and afraid. She leaned her head back against the stone, her shoulder brushing against his. He did not pull away. The small point of contact was an anchor in the overwhelming darkness. She could feel the steady strength of him, the deep, quiet calm that seemed to reside at his core. Even now, she thought of all they had been through: the saloon, the burned-out station, the sandstorm, the attack on her ranch, the desperate chase. In all of it, he had been her constant, a man who spoke with actions more than words, who had shown her respect and given her strength. He had seen the secrets she had kept buried, her shame and her guilt, and he had not judged her. He had answered with his own story, his own pain. She turned her head in the darkness. Though she could not see his face, she knew he was looking at her. She could feel the intensity of his gaze. The roar of the river seemed to fade, the world shrinking to the small, dark space they shared. This was more than a partnership forged in adversity. It was a connection, a bond that ran deeper than their shared purpose. It was a quiet, fragile thing that had grown between them in the spaces of silence, in shared glances, in acts of mutual care. It was a trust that had become something more, something that she was afraid to name, but even more afraid to lose. Her voice, when she spoke, was a whisper, a sound that was almost lost in the noise of the water. But in their small world, it was as clear as a bell. Stay with me, fully. It was not a plea for him to stay the night. It was a plea for him to stay in her life, to not be a ghost who would ride away once his brother was found. It was a plea for all of him: the warrior, the scout, the haunted brother, the quiet man who listened with his bones. It was an offering of all of herself: the stubborn rancher, the grieving daughter, the woman who had made compromises and was now fighting for redemption. It was a question, a hope, and a declaration. He was silent for a long moment. She felt him shift beside her, a subtle movement in the dark. He took her hand, his fingers warm and strong, lacing through hers. The simple touch was an answer, a confirmation that resonated through her entire being. When he spoke, his voice was a low, deep rumble, a sound of absolute certainty that cut through the chaos of the flood. Only you. It was a vow, a promise, an acknowledgement that in his world of ghosts and broken trails, she was his one true north. It was the simplest of phrases, yet it held the weight of a lifetime. It was everything. A new kind of silence settled between them, a quiet covenant made in the dark. The roar of the river was no longer a threat, but a witness. The cold was no longer an enemy, but a reason to draw closer. They leaned into each other, and the shared blanket became a sanctuary. The exhaustion that had been a torment now became a release, a deep, healing peace that settled over them, pulling them down into a shared, dreamless sleep. When they awoke, the world was washed in the pale, clean light of morning. The river had receded, its roar diminished to a steady, powerful murmur. The sun, breaking through the clouds, sent shafts of light through the gaps in the timbers above, painting stripes on the damp ground. Eleanor stirred, feeling a warmth and a sense of safety she had not known for years. She was still wrapped in his bedroll, his arm still around her. She did not move, wanting to hold the moment, to imprint it on her memory. He was awake, watching her. There was no awkwardness in the morning light, no regret. There was only a quiet, steady tenderness in his dark eyes. A new chapter had begun. The bond between them had been reforged in the darkness under the bridge, tempered by the flood. It was no longer just a collaboration for survival. It was a shared life, a shared responsibility. His quest to save his brother was now hers, not just as an ally, but as a partner. Her fight for her ranch was now his, not just as a refuge, but as the foundation of a future. They rose and went about the morning chores, moving with a new, unspoken grace, a shared look, a light touch on the arm as they saddled the horses, a silent agreement to face whatever came next. Together, the respite was over. They were rested, they were healed, and they were ready for the final battle. The Granite Pass switchback was a scar carved into the face of the mountain, a place where the railroad had been forced to bow to the unyielding power of the earth. The tracks wound back and forth in a tight, ascending zigzag, a man-made serpent of steel and wood. It was here, on the steepest grade, that the iron horse was at its most vulnerable, its great strength reduced to a labored, groaning crawl, and it was here that they would make their stand. They lay hidden in a cluster of wind-sculpted piñon pines on the ridge overlooking the sharpest turn. Below them, the rusted lever that controlled the switch to a short, dead-end siding was half overgrown with tough, tenacious weeds. For 2 days, they had watched, studied, and prepared. They had cleared the brush from the switch mechanism and tested the heavy, resistant lever. Eleanor had found a massive, waterlogged timber washed up from the flood, and with her horse, had dragged it into position near the end of the siding. A final, brutal stop if the train's brakes failed. They moved with a shared, silent intensity, their every action a testament to the promise made in the darkness beneath the San Juan Bridge. The ledger they had taken from the mine was a weapon, but it was not enough. It was one man's word against the power and money of Ezekiel Dorn. They needed more. They needed to stop the next dynamite shipment, to expose the operation in the act, and Atza, with a cold ache in his soul, needed to pull his brother from the fire. The sound came first, a low, rhythmic chuffing that vibrated through the rock beneath them. Then, the whistle, a long, mournful cry that echoed off the canyon walls. It was not the proud call of progress Eleanor remembered from her childhood. It was a tormented sound, the shriek of a great beast, chained and angry, being driven up a hill against its will. The tension in the air became a physical thing, a pressure against the skin. The locomotive appeared, a black engine spewing a thick column of greasy smoke, its massive drive wheels turning with agonizing slowness. Behind it were 3 cars, a coal tender, a single, ominous boxcar with the number 13 faded on its side, and an open flat car. On the flat car stood 3 men. Eleanor, watching through the spyglass, felt her breath catch. She whispered his name, a sound of pure venom. Dorn. Ezekiel Dorn stood near the front of the car, a thick cigar clamped in his teeth, his posture one of arrogant ownership. Beside him, wearing his badge of office like a shield, was Marshal Pike. Atza did not need the spyglass. His eyes were fixed on the third figure. It was Nakai. He was standing between the 2 powerful white men, a rifle held loosely in his hands. He wore the clothes of a hired gun, but his face was a hollow mask of despair. His eyes were not on the track ahead, but on the empty, unforgiving sky. He was not a guard. He was a prop, a living piece of evidence to be displayed if needed. The native face to blame for the next staged raid. Atza felt the photograph in his shirt press against his chest. The sight of his brother, so close and so utterly broken, was a physical blow. The guilt and rage he had carried for so long coalesced into a single, sharp point of purpose. He would not fail him again. He gave Eleanor's hand a quick squeeze, a silent command, and then he was gone, slipping down the rocky slope toward the tracks like a flowing shadow. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She moved to her horse, coiling the thick rope attached to the timber around her saddle horn, her knuckles white. The train groaned as it hit the steepest part of the grade. The rhythmic chuffing of the engine became a frantic, gasping pant. The screech of steel wheels on the tight curve was a sound that set the teeth on edge. Atza reached the switch lever, his body hidden by a thicket of scrub oak. He crouched, watching the massive engine approach, feeling the ground tremble. He had one chance. If he threw the lever too soon, the engineer would see it and apply the brakes. Too late, and the engine would pass, leaving only the cars to be derailed in a catastrophic pileup. The locomotive's front wheels were almost upon the switch point. The engineer was leaning out, his attention on the curve ahead. Now. Atza rose and threw his entire body against the heavy iron lever. For a terrible second, it refused to move, rusted and stiff from disuse. He pushed again, a guttural cry torn from his throat, a sound of pure desperation. With a groan of tortured metal, the lever moved. The switch point shifted, the motion almost lost in the greater noise of the train. On the flat car, the sudden, jarring lurch as the locomotive was shunted onto the siding took everyone by surprise. Dorn stumbled, catching himself on the side of the car. Pike was thrown to his knees. Nakai merely swayed, his vacant expression unchanging, as if he were a passenger on a journey whose destination he had long since ceased to care about. That moment of chaos was Atsa's opening. He burst from the cover of the trees, his legs pumping, and launched himself across the short gap. He landed on the flat car in a crouch, the impact jarring his bones. He rose, ignoring the shocked face of Ezekiel Dorn, his entire focus on the marshal. Pike scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, his hand clawing for the pistol at his hip. Atsa was faster. He closed the distance in 2 strides, his fist connecting with the marshal's jaw in a solid, satisfying crack. Pike staggered back, his pistol clearing the holster. Above them, Eleanor saw the switch had worked, but the train, even on the slight incline of the siding, was not stopping fast enough. The boxcar, heavy with its deadly cargo, was pushing the engine forward. It was going to crash through the end of the line and into the ravine beyond. She did not hesitate. She spurred her horse, a sharp cry on her lips, and the powerful animal leaped forward, dragging the heavy timber with it. The log slid across the tracks at the very end of the siding, a crude but solid barricade. On the flat car, the world was a blur of motion and violence. Pike, recovering, swung his pistol like a club. Atsa ducked under the blow, driving his shoulder into the marshal's midsection. They crashed against the side of the boxcar, a tangled, grunting knot of limbs. Pike was stronger, but Atsa was quicker, his movements fueled by years of rage and a singular, burning purpose. He saw Nakai watching them, his brother's eyes finally focused, a flicker of horrified awareness dawning in their depths. The train's brakes shrieked, a high, piercing scream of metal on metal as the engineer finally realized what was happening. The siding ended. The train was going to hit the log. Atsa braced himself. Pike, caught off balance, was not prepared for the final, violent jolt. As the locomotive slammed into the timber, the flat car bucked like a wild horse. The impact threw both men apart. Atsa managed to catch a handhold, but Pike was thrown clear, his body arcing through the air. He landed with a sickening thud in the gravel and rock beside the track and did not move. With a final, shuddering groan, the train came to a stop. A profound silence descended, broken only by the hissing of steam from the engine and the frantic panting of Eleanor's horse. Dorn stood frozen. His cigar dropped, his face pale with shock. He was trapped. Atsa pushed himself to his feet, his body bruised, his knuckles bleeding. He turned to his brother. He said his name, his voice thick with 1,000 unspoken emotions. Nakai. Nakai looked at him, at the man who had appeared out of nowhere like a spirit of vengeance. He looked at the unconscious form of Marshal Pike. He looked at Eleanor, who was now dismounting, her face streaked with dirt, a shotgun held loosely but ready in her hands. The rifle slipped from his numb fingers and clattered onto the wooden planks of the flat car. He did not run to Atsa. He did not speak. He simply stood there, saved but not whole, his eyes filled with a universe of pain, confusion, and a trust so deeply broken it seemed impossible to ever mend. The battle was over. The dynamite was secured. The lawman was captured. The tyrant was cornered. But as Atsa looked into his brother's empty eyes, he knew the war for Nakai's soul had just begun. The courthouse was the grandest building in the county, a 2-story structure of cut stone perched on a high mesa overlooking Sierra Crossing. It was meant to project an image of permanence and authority, a fortress of law in a lawless land. But as the townspeople filed in, filling the polished wooden benches, the atmosphere was not one of reverence. It was thick with a tense, brittle energy. the air humming with whispered speculation and hostile stares. On one side of the aisle sat Dorn's men, a sullen block of hired muscle and nervous businessmen whose names were written in his ledger. On the other sat a smaller, more varied group, Eleanor, with Atsa beside her, old Ben the blacksmith, and a handful of other small ranchers and merchants who had suffered under Dorn's shadow and had finally found the courage to bear witness. At the front of the room, Ezekiel Dorn sat beside a man who looked as out of place in this dusty courthouse as an orchid in a desert. He was a lawyer from San Francisco, dressed in a fine wool suit, his face smooth and confident. He radiated an aura of expensive, dismissive power. Beside them, looking pale and diminished in a borrowed suit, sat Marshall Pike, now a prisoner facing his own charges. The circuit judge, a man named Harlan Blackwood, was a stern, hawk-nosed man with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was an outsider, immune to local politics and pressures, and he ran his courtroom with an iron will. He listened patiently as the acting marshal, Deputy Torres, laid out the evidence, the heavy ledger with its damning entries, the manifest for the dynamite in Car 13, and the sworn statements from the train's engineer. The case seemed simple, a clear and undeniable conspiracy. Then Dorn's lawyer, Mr. Sterling, rose to speak, and the simple case began to twist and fray. He did not dispute the existence of the ledger, he merely reframed it. It was, he claimed, a record of necessary security expenses in a volatile territory, a private log of payments made to protect the railroad's legitimate interests from saboteurs and native raiders. His voice, smooth and persuasive, filled the room. He said, "The railroad is a great engine of civilization, Your Honor, but civilization has its enemies. It must be defended. My client, Mr. Dorn, is a builder, a visionary, and these people," he gestured dismissively toward the witnesses, "are the saboteurs." He began with old Ben, the blacksmith, his face scrubbed clean but his hands permanently stained with the marks of his trade. Spoke in a low, steady voice about his conversation with Eleanor's father, about the man's fears regarding the unstable track on the Granite Pass spur. On cross-examination, Sterling was merciless. He asked, "Is it not true, Mr. Ben, that you lost a shipping contract with the railroad 5 years ago? Is it not true that you have held a grudge against my client ever since? Is it not possible that your memory of this conversation, a conversation with a man now tragically deceased, has been colored by years of resentment?" Ben faltered. His honest anger twisted into the shape of a petty grievance. Then they called Nakai. He walked to the stand like a ghost, his eyes downcast. He answered the prosecutor's questions in a monotone, confirming that he had been hired by Dorn's foreman, that he had witnessed the illegal shipments, that he had been on the flat car during the ambush. When Sterling rose to question him, the lawyer's voice became a purr of false sympathy. He asked, "Young man, you were found in the company of known malcontents. Correct. You were, shall we say, drifting, without prospects. Mr. Dorn's foreman gave you a job. Did he not? Food, a roof over your head. And how did you repay this kindness? You joined with your renegade brother in a violent attack on your employer." Nakai flinched at the word "a renegade." He looked at Atsa, his eyes a well of confusion and shame. Atsa met his gaze, his own expression unreadable, a mask of iron control over a storm of emotion. Nakai mumbled, I just... Sterling pounced. He said, "You just what, son? Just went along. Is that not your way, to drift from one trouble to another? How can this court possibly trust the word of a boy who so readily betrays those who try to help him?" The lawyer turned to the judge, a picture of sorrowful reason, a troubled, violent boy. "Your Honor, easily led. His testimony is worthless." Then it was Eleanor's turn. She walked to the stand with a straight back and a steady gaze, her simple calico dress a stark contrast to Sterling's finery. The prosecutor led her through her story of the harassment, the cut fences, the attack on her ranch. When Sterling rose, he was holding a piece of paper. He asked, "Miss Whitlock, Is this your signature on a contract to supply hay to the Sierra Pacific Railroad, the very company you now accuse of wrongdoing?" Eleanor replied clearly, "It is." Sterling smiled. A thin, predatory expression. He said, "So you were, in fact, a business partner of Mr. Dorn's enterprise. And when that business relationship ended, you suddenly concocted these wild accusations. Tell me, Miss Whitlock, is this entire proceeding simply a case of a woman scorned, a woman who, perhaps, took up with a known savage to enact some sort of personal revenge?" The insult hung in the air, ugly and calculated. Eleanor felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but she did not let her anger show. She looked not at the lawyer, but directly at Judge Blackwood. She said, "Yes, I signed that contract. I signed it a month after my father was killed in a railroad accident. I signed it because I was in debt, and Mr. Dorn's man made it clear that signing it was the only way I would be allowed to keep my ranch. I signed it because I was a grieving daughter, alone and scared. I made a mistake. I chose silence when I should have spoken up, but I am not silent anymore. My father died because he knew that spur line was dangerous. He died because he was an honest man who would not put his name on a lie. Mr. Dorn did not want a business partner. Your Honor, he wanted my silence, and he wanted my water. He will have neither." She spoke with a simple, unadorned power that silenced the room. She had taken the lawyer's weapon and disarmed him with the plain truth. She was not a woman scorned. She was a woman who had found her voice. Finally, they called Atza. As he walked to the stand, a low, hostile murmur rippled through Dorn's side of the courtroom. Sterling eyed him with open contempt. Atza ignored them all, his movements calm and deliberate. He took the oath and sat, his posture straight, his hands resting on his knees. Sterling began immediately, his voice dripping with condescension. He asked, "You are Atza Bege, a former scout for the United States Army, I believe. A man paid to hunt down his own kind. A reliable occupation." Atza replied, his voice even, "I was a scout." Sterling continued, "And you came to this town, and within days, you are involved in a saloon brawl, a gunfight at Miss Whitlock's ranch, and a violent, premeditated attack on a train. Does that sound about right? You seem to bring trouble with you wherever you go." Atza said, "Trouble was here long before I arrived. I came looking for my brother. I found him in the service of a man who used him as a shield and was ready to cast him aside as a scapegoat. I found this." He reached into his shirt and placed the tin-type photograph on the railing of the witness box. The prosecutor entered it as evidence. The image of Nakai, lost and broken among Dorn's grinning thugs, was a powerful, silent testimony. Sterling, seeing he was losing ground, sneered. He asked, "And what is your claim here? That your people have some ancestral right to land the United States government granted to the railroad? Are we to halt progress because of your myths and legends?" Atza looked at the lawyer. He looked at the judge. Then his gaze lifted, moving past them, toward the tall, open windows that framed the vast, sunlit expanse of the high desert. When he spoke again, his English was simple, direct. He said, "A man's name is not a myth. A man's family is not a legend. My brother is not a tool for you to use and break. This land is not a line on your map." Then he straightened his back, and the air in the room seemed to change. The quiet, watchful man was gone, replaced by someone older, someone with the weight of generations in his voice. He began to speak in Dine. The words were fluid, guttural, filled with a music and a power that the stone walls of the courthouse could not contain. He spoke not to the court, but to the land, to his ancestors, to the holy people. He spoke of the earth as a mother, of the water as her lifeblood. He spoke of his brother not as a lost boy, but as a branch of a family tree that was rooted deep in that very soil. He declared that a voice, a people, and the earth they walked upon were not property. They could not be bought. They could not be sold. They could not be erased. When he finished, the silence was absolute. The lawyer was speechless. his clever words useless against something he could not comprehend. The townspeople sat in stunned silence. Judge Blackwood stared at Atsa, his stern expression unreadable. But for the first time, a flicker of profound respect showed in his eyes. The judge cleared his throat. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the photograph. He looked at Ezekiel Dorn, whose confident smirk had finally vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. Judge Blackwood's voice was like the crack of a gavel. He said, "This court has heard sufficient evidence to believe that a conspiracy to defraud, endanger, and intimidate the citizens of this county has taken place. I am therefore binding Mr. Ezekiel Dorn over for trial by a federal grand jury. Marshal Pike will remain in custody. This court is adjourned." A wave of sound broke through the room, a mixture of shocked gasps and triumphant shouts. Dorn and his lawyer were immediately surrounded by a phalanx of their men, who hurried them out of the courthouse. Eleanor, Atsa, Nakai, Old Ben, and Torres stood together in a small, quiet group. They had won. It was a victory, but a fragile one. As they looked out the window and saw Dorn climbing into his carriage, his face a thunderous mask, they knew this was not the end. It was the beginning of a new and more dangerous chapter. The law had spoken, but the final judgment would not be rendered in a courtroom. It would be decided out on the land, under the wide and unforgiving sky. The victory in the courthouse did not bring peace. It brought a tense, watchful quiet. Ezekiel Dorn was free on his own recognizance, a legal formality that felt like a mockery of justice to the people whose lives he had tried to ruin. He remained in Sierra Crossing, a thundercloud on the horizon, and his presence poisoned the air. The townspeople who had testified now walked with a new caution, their eyes scanning the rooftops and alleyways. The brief, bright flare of community courage had given way to a low, simmering anxiety. They had won the battle of words, but the war for the land was not over. For 3 days, the wind blew from the east, a hot, dry breath that sucked the last of the moisture from the overgrazed pastures and brittle forests. It was a nervous wind, rattling the loose panes of glass in Eleanor's ranch house and whispering through the eaves like a harbinger of bad things to come. Atsa spent his days watching the horizon, his stillness a counterpoint to the restless air. He and Eleanor moved around each other with a quiet, unspoken understanding, the memory of the San Juan Bridge a warm and solid thing between them. Nakai remained a ghost in their midst, eating the food they gave him, sleeping in the spare bunk, but speaking to no one. The trust that had been shattered in him was a wound that would not close, and he looked at his brother with eyes that held a universe of resentment and confusion. On the evening of the 4th day, the smell came. It was not the familiar scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's hearth. This was a sharper, wilder smell, the scent of a forest on fire. They went outside and saw it, a faint, angry orange glow pulsing against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. Far to the south, at the mouth of the valley. It started as a trickle and became a flood. The first to arrive was a family in a buckboard wagon, their faces pale with fear, their children crying in the back. The man said the fire had come out of nowhere, a wall of flame that seemed to leap from ridge to ridge. They had saved nothing but themselves. Soon after, others came, on horseback and on foot. A small, sad exodus of families driven from their homes. They all came to Eleanor's ranch, the place that had become the symbol of their defiance. It was the only place they felt safe. Old Ben arrived, his face grim, leading a pair of pack mules loaded with his most precious tools. Sister May from the mission came with 2 young children whose parents had been caught on the wrong side of the fire line. The small community of the dispossessed gathered in the ranch yard, their faces lit by the growing, hellish glow to the south, their voices a low murmur of fear and disbelief. Atsa stood apart, his gaze fixed on the fire. He was not looking at the flames themselves, but at the towering column of smoke rising into the sky. He watched the way it bent and twisted, reading the story of the wind. This was no wildfire. It had been set deliberately, in a dozen different places, a calculated act of war designed to create an unstoppable front of flame. Dorn was not just trying to punish them, he was trying to erase them, to scour the valley clean of their existence. Then the wind, their constant, tormenting companion, began to shift. The change was subtle at first, a slight cooling, a different feel on the skin, but Atsa felt it instantly, a deep, primal alarm ringing within him. He watched the smoke column. It was no longer leaning away to the west. It was starting to stand straight. Then, slowly, inexorably, it began to bend toward them, toward the north, toward Whitlock Draw. A collective gasp went through the crowd as they felt it too. The fire was turning. The wind, which had been driving the flames parallel to them, was now pushing the inferno directly at them. Panic began to ripple through the small gathering. They were trapped. In the midst of the rising chaos, Atsa's voice cut through the noise. Calm and clear, he said, "We will not run. We will fight it." Old Ben looked at him, his face etched with disbelief. He yelled over the growing roar, "Fight it! With what, boy? Buckets of water." Atsa pointed not at the main fire, but at the dry pasture land between the ranch and the approaching flames. He said, "We will fight it with fire. We will build a fire break, and then we will burn the grass ahead of it. A back burn. When the big fire gets here, it will have nothing left to eat." The idea was met with stunned silence. It sounded like madness, to set another fire when one was already threatening to consume them. But Eleanor, standing beside him, understood. It was a calculated risk, a desperate but brilliant strategy. She looked at the frightened faces around her, the children clutching their mother's skirts, the old men and women with despair in their eyes. She had to get them to safety. She raised her voice, and it carried the same note of authority that had silenced the courtroom. She said, "Atsa is right. The men who can work. You will go with him. The rest of us, the children, the elders. You will come with me." She pointed to the wide and sandy bed of the dry creek that ran behind the ranch. "It offers a clear path out of the draw. It is our best chance. Follow me, now." Her certainty was an anchor in their fear. The group split. Atsa, Old Ben, Deputy Torres, who had ridden out at the first sign of trouble, and a half-dozen other able-bodied men grabbed shovels, axes, and heavy blankets. They ran out into the pasture to begin the frantic work of clearing a wide line down to the bare dirt. Eleanor, with Sister May's help, began to herd the others toward the creek bed. In the confusion, Nakai stood alone, frozen, a spectator to the unfolding disaster. Eleanor put a hand on his arm. She said, "Nakai, help me. We need to make sure everyone gets to the creek." He looked at her, his eyes blank for a moment, and then he nodded, a flicker of purpose returning to his face. He began to move through the crowd, his voice low, guiding a frightened elderly couple, lifting a small child who had fallen. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his knowledge of the terrain, learned in a different, darker time, now put to a good use. The main fire was a monstrous thing now, a roaring, multi-headed beast that devoured everything in its path. The heat was a physical blow, and the air was thick with smoke and a blizzard of glowing embers. Atsa and his small crew worked with a desperate fury, their faces black with soot, their lungs burning. They finished the firebreak, a raw, dark scar of earth 50 feet wide. Atsa took a burning branch from a nearby campfire. He walked the length of the firebreak, on the side closest to the ranch, and set the dry grass alight. For a terrifying moment, the new fire leapt up, a hungry serpent of flame that seemed just as dangerous as the one they were fighting. But the wind, their enemy, was now their ally. It pushed the new, smaller fire south, away from the ranch, creating a growing expanse of blackened, burned-out earth. In the creek bed, Eleanor led her small band of refugees through the choking smoke. The world was a disorienting nightmare of orange light and black shadows. She kept a head count, her voice hoarse from shouting encouragement. As they reached a bend in the creek, a woman screamed. she cried out. "My son, Daniel, where is he?" In the chaos of the evacuation, a small boy of 6 had slipped away. He had last been seen near the small barn where Eleanor kept her tools. Eleanor's heart went cold. The barn was directly in the path of the fire. Before anyone could move, Nakai was gone. He plunged back into the smoke, his lithe form swallowed by the haze. Atsa, seeing him go, felt a jolt of pure terror. He started to follow, but old Ben grabbed his arm. The blacksmith yelled, "The back burn, we have to hold this line." Atsa was torn, his heart ripping in two, but he knew Ben was right. He had to trust his brother. Nakai ran, his lungs on fire, his eyes streaming. He knew a shortcut, a small game trail that led directly to the barn. The heat was intense, the air almost unbreathable. He found the barn, its roof already smoldering. The boy was inside, hiding under a workbench, crying with terror. Nakai scooped him up. As he turned to leave, a burning beam crashed down, blocking the main door. He ran to the back, to a small opening he knew was there, and squeezed through just as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. He ran with the boy in his arms, his own fear forgotten, replaced by a fierce, protective instinct he did not know he possessed. He emerged from the smoke and placed the sobbing child into his mother's arms. He looked across the field of fire and saw his brother, standing on the firebreak, watching him, for the first time in a long time. He met Atsa's gaze, and in his eyes was not shame, but the clear, bright light of a debt repaid. At that moment, Deputy Torres, who had been watching the ridges, shouted and pointed against the fiery backdrop. They saw 2 riders. They were carrying torches, throwing them into patches of unburned grass, trying to ensure the ranch's destruction. Torres raised his rifle. He yelled, "It is Dorn!" The riders were too far for a clean shot, but they were trapped. Behind them was the main fire. Before them was the back burn. They were on a small island of green, and it was shrinking fast. Dorn, in a final act of insane rage, threw his last torch. His remaining hired man turned his horse to flee. The deputy's rifle cracked. The man cried out and fell from his saddle. Dorn was alone, his horse rearing in terror, surrounded by the inferno he had created. He was caught between 2 fires, a perfect image of his own destructive soul. Deputy Torres and Atsa moved forward, their faces grim, and took him prisoner without a fight. The 2 fires met in a great, roaring crescendo, a battle of titans that lasted for a full minute, and then, with nothing left to consume, they died. A vast, profound silence fell over the valley, broken by the exhausted coughing of the survivors and the hiss of smoldering embers. The land was a blackened, smoking ruin. Homes were gone, livelihoods were destroyed, but they were alive. The community had held, and the fire, in its terrible, destructive fury, had also been a cleansing. It had burned away the last of Dorn's power, and in the ashes, something new, something stronger, was ready to be born. The rain that followed the fire was not a storm, but a soft, cleansing whisper. It fell for a day and a night, settling the ash, cooling the scorched earth, and washing the soot from the faces of the survivors. In the gray, quiet dawn that followed, a new kind of community began to stir in the muddy yard of Eleanor Whitlock's ranch. The fire had taken their homes, but it had not taken their spirit. It had burned away the petty squabbles and old distrust, leaving only a shared, stubborn will to rebuild. Old Ben, his forge destroyed, was already sketching plans for a new, larger smithy in the dirt with a stick, arguing good-naturedly with another rancher about the best placement for the quench barrel. Sister May had organized the women into a communal kitchen in Eleanor's house, stretching the meager supplies to feed everyone. Deputy Torres, his authority now unquestioned, rode patrols, not as a lawman watching over a town, but as a neighbor protecting his own. The news of Ezekiel Dorn's final fate came a week later, not with a bang, but with a folded newspaper delivered by the mail rider. A federal judge in a distant city, presented with the irrefutable evidence of the ledger and Deputy Torres's testimony, had sentenced Dorn to a long term in a federal penitentiary. His assets were seized to pay for the damages he had caused. Ex-Marshal Pike, his reputation in tatters, was dishonorably discharged and had vanished, a disgraced man with nowhere to go. Their reign was over, their names already fading into a cautionary tale whispered by old men, amid the slow, arduous work of clearing and rebuilding. Atsa and Nakai returned to the small patch of land by the stream, the place of their mother's people. The fire had swept through the canyon, leaving the pinon and juniper trees as blackened skeletons. The earth itself was charred and sterile. For a full day, the two brothers worked in silence, clearing the debris, their shared grief and guilt a heavy blanket between them. Then, near the bank of the stream, Nakai found it, a single, small cottonwood sapling, sheltered by a rock outcropping, its leaves seared but its heartwood still green and alive. He knelt and touched it, a look of wonder on his face. Atsa came and knelt beside him. He looked at his brother, at the first flicker of hope he had seen in his eyes since the rescue. Atsa's voice was low. He said, "I should have been here. I should not have left you." Nakai did not look at him. He looked at the small tree, a tiny spot of life in a world of death. He replied, his voice raspy from disuse. "You came back." It was enough. It was forgiveness and acceptance in 3 small words. Atsa took out the juniper-handled knife, the one he had recovered from Dorn's man, and began to carefully dig the soil around the sapling. Nakai joined him. Using his bare hands, they worked together, their silence now a comfortable one, and transplanted the small tree to the center of the clearing where their family's summer shelter had once stood. It was the first act of rebuilding, a promise planted in the ashes. At the ranch, Eleanor found her own new purpose taking root. In the evenings, after the long days of work, she would gather the children in her parlor and read to them from the few books she had managed to save from the fire. She saw the hunger in their eyes. A hunger not just for food and shelter, but for stories, for knowledge, for a sense of a future that was not defined by loss. One evening, as she was reading to a small, rapt audience that included Daniel, the boy Nakai had saved, the idea took shape in her mind, clear and bright. The next morning, she gathered Sister May and old Ben on her porch. She declared, "This ranch is more than a home now. It is a community, and a community needs a school." She gestured to her parlor. "I have the space, I have the books, and Sister May, you have the patience of a saint. We will call it the Sierra Crossing Schoolhouse." The plan was simple, born of necessity and hope. It was a declaration that they would not just rebuild what was lost, but build something better in its place. The fire had cleared the ground for a new kind of growth. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm established itself. By day, the valley was a hive of activity, the sound of hammers and saws replacing the roar of the fire. In the evenings, a quieter work took place, the work of healing. Atsa and Nakai began to construct a small, traditional hogan near their newly planted tree, the circular structure a symbol of their renewed family bond. At the ranch, the murmur of children learning their letters drifted from the windows of the new schoolhouse. One cool evening, as the sun set, Eleanor and Atsa worked together, stringing the last section of a new fence line. The barbed wire gleamed in the fading light, sharp and new. They worked in the easy, synchronized rhythm of people who knew each other's movements without needing to speak. He would set a post, and she would be there with the staples. She would stretch the wire, and he would be there to anchor it. He paused in his work, taking his canteen and offering it to her. She drank, then handed it back, their fingers brushing. It was their ritual, a simple act of sharing that held the weight of the promise made under the bridge. She looked out over the valley, at the first tender green shoots of grass beginning to push through the blackened soil. She said, "It will take a long time, but the land will heal." Atsa looked at her, at the strength and the hope in her face. He replied, "We will heal with it." There was no formal proposal, no talk of marriage or ownership. Their love was not a thing to be bound by contracts or ceremonies. It was a partnership, a choice they made every day. He had his home by the stream, and she had her ranch and her school. They were two strong trees, their roots separate but their branches intertwined, providing shade and shelter for each other and for the new community they were helping to build. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. The bond between them was a quiet, unshakable thing, as real and as solid as the earth beneath their feet. When the last staple was hammered home, they stood together and looked at their work, a clean, strong fence, marking the border of her land. But the feeling was different now. Before, the wire had been a symbol of defiance, a barrier to keep a hostile world at bay. Now, it was something else. It was a line drawn around a home, a sanctuary. It was the edge of a place where justice had been won not by a single hero, but by a community that had dared to speak. It was the boundary of a future they would build together. A clean wind, free of smoke and fear, blew down from the high mesas. It sang a low, clear note as it passed through the new strands of wire, a sound of hope and promise. It was the sound of a new beginning. Thank you for joining our story. We invite you to comment where you are listening from to connect with the community. Subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like the video, and press the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.